We gave this the title, What I Have Learned from Being on the Radio, and I'm not entirely sure what I have learned from being on the radio. The main thing was to see whether it's possible to merchandise philosophy to a broader audience than normally reads philosophic books or even philosophical novels. Whether there's a way to mainline philosophy into the arteries of America without going through the digestive educational system. So I think the thing you'd probably find most interesting is what subjects, what topics, we've tried every conceivable approach, what topics worked and what didn't to create in the audience enthusiasm over the idea of philosophy, who needs it, and then it's up to an inductive genius to put it together and say, this is the common denominator and the key to the future. I mean Andrew Lewis, my producer, and Richard Ralston, the executive producer, and I have some clues as to what is succeeding and what isn't, but we're still continuously surprised, I am, by which things we think are going to be terrific that bomb totally, and which things we think are very risky, but we'll take one chance in 100 in our spectacular successes, judged by audience enthusiasm, the number of calls, etc. So I'll just give you some data to start with. This is compiled across going on 2 years now. It is completely predictable that if you take a topic right in the newspapers that day or week, front page, that has a controversial element to it and devote a show to it, you have an audience. There's no question about that. And you can even inject philosophy into the show, so long as you make it clear that the philosophy grows out of the controversy and the heat over that topic. So there's dozens of shows. We went right to press with marked clippings, right to the air with just marked, my scrawl in the margin, and then just give a diatribe or elicit questions. And the trick of a show is not to give a long diatribe at the beginning, but to have it ready in pieces, and then with each caller you would give them one little bit of it so that it doesn't sound too preachy, and then at the end you wrap it up. But for instance, sending troops to Bosnia, which was originally completely controversial, we were swamped. Christmas should be more commercial. Giving that on December the 23rd as our annual Christmas show, and that just ticks off fundamentalists. Cloning, coming out strongly for cloning. Explaining the San Diego mass suicide as a rational application of religious principles. We had a show called Who Lost Hong Kong, in which I traced it all the way back to the Eisenhower administration and ended with what we should do with regard to Hong Kong, down to bombing Red China if they tried to carry out this pact with the British. That certainly stirred people up. And I'm sure, for instance, this Sunday, we're going to do 1 hour on the United Parcels strike, and unless they settle, now if they settle, it'll be dead. And there's hints already the United Parcels is going to give in. There was hints in the paper this morning. But if it's still a strike on Sunday, the thing is you can go on forever with those type of topics. The problem with that type of topic is that the amount of philosophy you get in is relatively small. The callers want to argue the facts. They want to argue, well, were these people who committed suicide really Christians? After all, they believed in a comet and not a Christmas star, etc., and so on. A great deal of the discussion, you can't just shunt them off and say, no, that's ridiculous, and give them a speech on metaphysics, because they just don't. They won't take it. They don't get it. And you come across as Johnny One Note, whatever, they say a Frenchman whatever you bring up, he talks about sex, and that proves the meaning of sex. Well, I can't dare get that reputation on the radio. Whatever anybody says, that's causes is philosophy, because they just ignore it. So you have to have a balance, and the hot topic shows are good for audience, but the more I'm like that, the more I'm like everybody else, you see, until you could get to be a popular host. If you leave out philosophy altogether, that's the only main obstacle that the show has. So I'll tell you now, within shows where we tried to be, there's not always breaking news that's worth talking about. I'll tell you some shows that we tried to do something different in. And I'll give you, just for the heck of it, 5 shows that we thought would be great successes that bombed totally. And then 5 shows that we were very hesitant about what the reaction would be. They were very unexpected successes. All of these shows being more abstract than a hot breaking story. Here are, I would say, the 5 worst shows, not so much judging by the content, but by the absolute lethargy and disinterest of the audience, to the point where at certain points, when I don't get calls, you just have to keep talking. You can't just leave the air blank. And, I look at Andrew, and he's rummaging in the files for something to keep on saying. And I'm repeating the number, the phone number to phone in and so on. That is a very, very unpleasant experience, because it gets down to the point of begging people to phone about anything, I think the very worst show from that point of view, was early in the show meetings, the show was a show on Freud. And I thought, well, gee, Freud is in all the movies, and everybody in Los Angeles, I was local at the time, is in psychotherapy, so this should be a good show. It was a total bomb. I had actually 4 callers across an hour, and one of them kept trying to hang up, and I said, let me just pursue this. Now, the programming director of the station, who's a wise old guy named Dick St. Clair, I asked him afterwards, how would he explain that? And he said, one of the first rules of programming of talk radio, do not put on a show of which the audience doesn't have in advance a very strong position. If you put on a show which they find interesting, but they never thought about it before the show, they won't call in, because they're just forming a view and they don't want to expose themselves, to a view they're brand new to and not that sure about. So he said, decide in advance, does your audience have a strong position? And most of them don't know anything about Freud. So they listen, but they're not going to phone in. And it didn't work. So that's one thing we learned. Philosophy, we had a couple of shows on philosophy, who needs it. I thought, we'll hit this directly. Tell them what is philosophy, but not just in theory. We will then go on and give real examples from the newspapers and people's lives and so on. And I learned that you cannot concretize that way. You cannot come on with a thesis and then tie it to concretes, because they tune out the thesis as such as being too abstract. Even if you say, I'm going to give you examples, even if you start with, here's an example and here's an example, and now I'm going to show you, that once they get the idea that you are being preachy or teachy, that you have an abstract point that you're trying to get across, you've lost your audience. Because the majority of the people tune out if they think it's going to be a discussion of abstractions as such. So this was a total disaster. And here I thought I was hitting the problem on the head and explaining to people why they should be interested. It can't be done. You can only do it by taking something that they already feel strong about, some concrete, starting on that concrete, and then inducing at the end. See, that's philosophy. So philosophy really matters. You can't make your theme philosophy is important, because it's simply too abstract for them to care about. Now, here's another show that I thought would be great. Show that I wasn't just a standard conservative, because you always have to differentiate yourself from, the rest of the right-wing shows. 10 errors in the Constitution. So I thought, wow, this will really grab all these conservatives. And what did they think? And I began by briefly indicating what I thought the 10 main mistakes in the Constitution were. And it was dead, utterly. And the reason that we decided was they simply could not take in 10 points. And even though I numbered them and I said you can talk about any one of these and I separated them, it was like the crow. People listening on the radio, the ideal from their point of view, and I think this is broader than just the radio, because radio is a much more intellectual medium, let me say, than TV, because you have to go by concepts. TV is a perceptual medium, and radio is a conceptual medium. So radio is the best mass market medium you're going to get. But they simply cannot take 10 subjects or 3 aspects and discuss what they think of this one or that one or even one of them. They just get overloaded and tune it out. It's an extreme example of the crow. Now, if somebody's reading a book, the fact of their motivation already puts them in a very small minority. And the fact that the pace is controlled by them, you can give them 5 points and they can stop and go back. But when they're listening, and most people are driving when they're listening or cooking or whatever they're doing, when you sweep over them with 10 points, they just tune it out. The ideal show from this point of view, but which is completely non-philosophical, is I think that the show on LA in the morning, the Bill Handel show, he's on for like 3 hours every morning. At first I used to wonder, since I do so much work to be on 2 hours a week, how does this guy get on 3 hours every morning? And it's very simple. He takes some one story out of the news, usually a supermarket tabloid type story, like mother leaves her 2 kids in overheated apartment. And then the question is, what do you think? Should she go to jail or not? Yes or no? The lines are open. And that's it. And then people phone denouncing her, and then once in a while some Christian will phone and say we have to have compassion. She probably had a lot of shopping to do. Now that is a guaranteed formula for success in radio, but the problem with that is it doesn't never get around to philosophy. Who needs it? But the closer you can come to a single, one note, for or against type show, the better you are. Then another show that was a total bomb, I thought I had the great idea for Valentine's week. I was a daily show at that time, and I had a series of different shows on different aspects of love and sex, culminating in sex as the expression of love, and it's not just materialistic and physical and so on. And I thought, what a perfect tie-in to Valentine's Day. And it was a complete bomb. I think maybe we had 2 or 3 callers. You've got to reach 13, 14 callers a show in order to be, considered a functional show. So 2 or 3 callers would be like if we had a room this size and the front row was full and the rest is empty. I mean, it's just reeks of the pathology of failure. So after this was over, I went to this programming director, Dick Sinclair, and I said, do you have any clue? I would have thought of any topic. Sex on Valentine's Day would be perfect. And he looked at me and he said, for your audience in talk radio, this is a subject that relates to the past, not the lives they are currently living. And that's when I first became aware of demographics. That, there are some younger people listening, but the great majority are in their 50s, their 60s, their 70s, get calls every once in a while from 80s and 90s. sex and love are not the issues dominant in their mind. Or if they are, those are usually women in their 30s and 40s, and they call Dr. Laura, rather than calling me. One more show that failed, and this one I'm baffled about. I'm constantly told by people, you have to be more positive. You get on there and you denounce, this war, and you denounce this strike, and you're always saying this is awful, this is horrible. Can't you have a positive show? I get that all the time. So we had a show, we took the title from Bishop Fulton Sheen, but with a credit, called Life is Worth Living Even Today. And it was supposed to be only what makes your life worth living. What do you enjoy about life? What's good? No negatives. And I contribute a lot, isn't that right? I made pages of lists of everything I like, from work down to, belt buckles, everything. So that I constantly had positives, on every level, art and so on. And we just didn't get colored. We got a few people, in a mealy-mouthed way, saying something not very much. And the audience just was not involved the way they are when you get them enraged and wanting to denounce. And yet the same people would send notes and letters, why don't you ever have a positive show? Now that one, I don't really know. To this day, I don't know, maybe I could have done it in a more congenial way, or maybe I just opened up too many possibilities. Instead of saying, what's your favorite movie, or, what one book made you happy or something, I just left it wide open and they were overwhelmed. Maybe it was the Crow. Now let me give you from the other side shows that we did with trepidation, and these shows came out tremendously well. Now some of this is an issue of the accident of who happens to be listening to you on a given day. Because if you, for instance, if you do it on a Friday of a long weekend, a lot of people leave town and they can't hear you. So your audience goes way down. Or very often a show is sparked by one really good comment early, and that inspires other people either to agree or disagree. And if the first couple of people are sort of out of focus, and you either have to cut them off or drain through them, it can set a tone. So maybe some of this is accident, but still, I do feel there's something in here. I think the most surprising success was a show called A Picture is Not an Argument, which was an epistemological show. The idea of it was, the way it came into being, I had been invited to take part in a debate on abortion, which I had announced on the show, and was all ready to go. And then a week or so before the debate, the people informed me that I should get my movies in. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, we have movies of abortions and all the blood and all the rest of it. And I assume you want to have some movies. And I said, I'm not making movies or participating in movies. This is supposed to be intellectual arguments. So I backed out of the thing. And then I had to explain to the audience why I thought this was irrational and completely anti-logic, this idea of throwing pictures in. And it turned out that there was an awful lot of cases where people used pictures in place of argument, not just, these pictures of fetuses being butchered, but pictures of all the starving Bosnians to get you to go over there and take part in an intervention, regardless of whether there's any logic to it. And I had several worked out like that. And this is really applied epistemology, but it's the conceptual level versus the perceptual level, which I explained on the show. Now, you'd think, this would just absolutely leave them cold. The lines were full all the time with people who didn't know anything about epistemology, calling in to give their own example and how offended they were by these people that try to use pictures as propaganda. And in fact, we had to run another whole show on that just to take the carryover of the calls. Now, whatever the secret was of that, if it could be duplicated, that would be the key to selling philosophy, because this was actually selling epistemology and on selling the conceptual level, which I would have thought is impossible. And it was a really, like one of the top successes. People phoned and said, I've listened to you for a year. This is the first thing that moved me to call and comment. And it was eerie to think that we've had all these hot topics and all these ethical and political topics, and here was an esoteric, relatively speaking, topic, and just, lit them all up completely. Along with that is a show that we do periodically. I'm doing it again this Sunday, called Dirty Words, which was also epistemology. It was the way I used to introduce anti-concepts. And it was the corruption in your thinking from, I explained that, I don't mean pornography, but words like isolationism, McCarthyism, extremism, radicalism, etc. And explain to them why these words are devised to destroy your ability to think, and that you should be wary of them. And I thought this in advance. I mean, we did it out of desperation because you can't keep saying you should be selfish and you have individual rights. And there's a limit to how much you have to try to press the envelope every once in a while. And again, I was astounded that number of people who wanted to call in and who were interested in language and words. And they turned me into a dictionary, and they were asking, well, is this word legitimate? How about the person who uses it for that? And all these people didn't know anything from objectivism, were really concerned with the meaning of language and the precision of language, and felt that some groups were using language in a way to corrupt the whole discussion. And they were really interested in that. Now, those two suggest to me that there's got to be some way of appealing to people directly through epistemology, because those are unusual. You see, sex failed, and the conceptual level succeeds. So there's something that is not known about this field. Now, on other surprising successes, I thought I will try a really difficult topic for the hell of it, just to see whether we would get anything. So one day I said, today I'm turning this over to you entirely, and I'm just asking you a simple question. What's the meaning of life? That's it. Just tell me the meaning of life, whatever you take that to be. And I gave a little sign, and I figured, that's so broad, and so generalized that no one, is going to come on and say anything. Again, the lines lit up totally. And I had the entire conceivable range of answers. If you were writing, fiction and you wanted to illustrate every conceivable view, I had, super religious people say the meaning of life is that they're going to leave this earth, and all the way down to, what did that woman say? Yeah, Cadillac, the meaning of life is Cadillac, clothes, and men, one woman said. And they gave their honest answers. And it was a tremendous range, and I could, talk with each one, and everything I said to one, then a whole new raft wanted to comment on that comment. So why they were interested in the meaning of life, but had nothing to say about life is worth living, it's hard to put together. But that was a surprise. And then two shows were a surprise on morality. One was, we always do a more or less frequently repeated show on the virtue of selfishness, which does okay, but they basically expect that of me by now, so it doesn't cause as much of a stir. But one show, which I did on a negative side of that, the evil of sacrifice. And that really flipped people out. Much more than the virtue of selfishness. The show called The Evil of Sacrifice. And I had only two kinds of callers, one of whom insisted you can't call sacrifice evil because everything you do in life is a sacrifice. You know, the idea that by the fact of choosing one thing over another, you're sacrificing the first thing, and therefore, how can you possibly say that? And then the other caller said it's impossible for anybody to sacrifice, so there's no use denouncing it because the fact that you choose it means that you wanted it more than any other thing. And I had these two groups, and they just couldn't wait to get at me to say, how can you possibly say that this thing, which is either impossible or unavoidable, is evil? So there again, it really came down to the definition of a concept that they were intent on more than how you should live. And then I think the last surprising show, we did one on perfection. Is perfection possible? Now, I would have thought, since the dominant viewpoint is, you know, man is rotten and life is hell and no one can achieve anything, that people would think, well, this is too obvious to be worth discussing, or, you know, there's just no point in that. But I figured it's a topic, and I was going to hold out for the view that perfection is possible in every category. You know, we started with the idea that Plato would say there's no perfect cup because you can run it over, and if you look at it under a microscope, it's jagged, and it finally gets old, and, you know, so on and so on. And on through, is there a perfect man? Can there be a perfect society? And I was surprised at the number of people that wanted to defend the possibility of perfection. There were a lot that didn't, but the number that did really surprised me. And the number of people who came on, and I would say as a kind of standard, well, are you perfect? And I got a number of people to say, no, I'm not. And then I'd say, why not? And then they list something that's obviously, you know, outside of their power, like they're not omniscient, they're not omnipotent. And I'd say, well, that's not relevant. And, you know, explain the point. I'd say, leaving that aside, what have you done that's immoral? What are you not doing that you think you should be doing? And I said, well, then by my definition, I don't see why you're imperfect. Can you explain it to me? And then they would grudgingly say, well, I guess there's nothing wrong with me then. And finally, I'd say to them, I want to hear you say over the air before all these people, I am perfect. And they would kind of swallow and say, I am perfect. But it was a very popular show. We had a lot of people wanted to get on, and then they started to come on and say, I am perfect too, you know. So what do I make of all this? I don't know. The conclusions that I come to in terms of what interests people in philosophy is, it's got to be simple. If you want to reach them, it has to be very simple in one note. The more you can tie it to something current and immediately of interest, the more you can tie it to something that they already have a viewpoint on, that they're prepared to come forward and argue, the better, but that you can go into what would seem to be esoteric questions of ethics or epistemology if there is some way they can really see the role of that issue in their lives, but they do not come to see the role by you telling it to them. You could be the most eloquent spokesman in the world for the role of a certain issue. They tune it out. They don't hear it. You have to hit them with the concretes first that they actually see and care about. And then some of them will be ripe for like an inductive generalization. But you cannot do radio as deduction. Here's the principle, and now here's examples, because they're gone by the time you do that. Now, the only other thing I'll say before I open it up to questions, if you have any about any other aspects or what you can learn from the show, is I just thought you might be interested in what I would have done with a topic and what I would do with it now in terms of distilling it into essentials. Now, I would have thought before going on the radio that if I wanted to present an answer to the question, is there a rational basis for ethics or do we need a God? You know Dostoevsky's statement, if there was no God, anything is permitted. If I wanted to refute that on the radio and to convince people that there's an objective reality basis for ethics. Now, I don't know whether you'll smile at this or not, but 2 years ago, I would have done something like this. I would have given them a definition of value, that which one acts to gain and keep, and said there, a few examples, and then said, well, you can't have values without life. So the whole issue comes up because of the requirements of a living organism, and it's obvious you have to live a certain way, and that's what morality is. I mean, I would have elaborated these, but then I said, that's what morality is, and therefore it's based on the objective requirements of a living thing, and that's why it can be scientific and it's not supernatural or social. That would have been my agenda, to go at it in that way, which might have been okay for, you know, say an article in TIA or even the Reader's Digest, but it'd be a total bomb, absolute hopeless. No one would listen. As soon as you say, I'm starting with the definition of value, that's the end. You may as well quit then, because they don't know that you need a definition of value. Definitions are things all people dislike on the radio because they don't have time to write it down. They're not listening that intently. And they don't see the purpose of it. It's just abstraction. If I were doing the same thing now, I would do it entirely through callers. I'd get people on and say, do you find any need for morality in your own life? Is there any actual need for it, or is it all just a waste of time and an obstacle? And then I would weed out the people who say, well, it's an obstacle because you have to give away and sacrifice and so on. And I'd elicit from the people who say honesty is the best policy. I say, well, why? Why couldn't you just lie your way through life or rob or kill, etc., and get them to say in their own terms, you know, that these things just don't work. You can't survive that way. Everybody would be at everybody's throat, and it would be the end of the world. And then I would at that point say, well, in other words, you are saying that there are certain principles that are required to survive successfully, that are absolutely inescapable by the nature of reality, regardless of whether anybody orders them or not. You say, yeah, that's right, you see. And then at that point, you say, well, then it's crazy to say that somebody has to order them. They come from reality. And that's what I mean by saying morality is objective. And then I could throw on a little thing about life has certain requirements and reality fulfilled. You see the difference? So that instead of trying to give them a song and dance and illustrate it, you do it on the narrowest concrete level that they actually see. And then you try to generalize if you can hold their interest through it. All right, now, if anybody wants to come up and ask anything about the show or what I've learned or what I haven't learned or make any observations, etc., you're welcome. Yes, sir.
I am perfect.
Terrific.
But I'm getting better.
Okay. Even that is not a contradiction, you know, because it's contextual. Yeah.
I heard the show. You stated early that you found you lose audience interest with a preaching approach and abstract topics.
Yeah.
By contrast, huge audiences, millions of listeners, tune in to listen to abstract topics and a preaching approach from religious preachers, yes. And then they send them money.
Yeah. Excellent point.
Are there any lessons here?
Well, that's a terrific question, and my answer to that is this. These preachers are counting on the fact that the ideology or the philosophy, the religion that they're preaching has already been mass established. There is already millions and millions of people who have been brought up in it, taught it, absorbed it from every aspect of the culture, and have believed very strongly that their future destiny in heaven depends on it. So they're cashing in on a pre-established market. And for instance, if the whole world or millions and millions of Americans were like this audience, I wouldn't have to do this, because there would already be a pre-established audience that would be delighted to hear me give a lecture on the objective basis of morality or the possibility of perfection, etc. The problem is there is no mass audience out there that's pre-established. There's three mass audiences, basically, all of them set to be antagonistic to objectivism. There's the right, which thinks atheism is an abomination, and the left, which thinks capitalism is an abomination, and the middle, which thinks extremism is an abomination. So whatever you say when you get up there, you're looked at with a jaundiced eye, and all three of them believe, if they unite on anything, it's that philosophy is generally a waste of time. I wish I had an audience that, you didn't have to do this to, but it just isn't there. I wish I had an audience that, you didn't have to do this to, but it just isn't there. But it's a really good fantasy to aspire to. Yes, Betsy.
Quite a few people here can listen to your radio program, and I was wondering if there's any way you could give us a signal when you would like or not like calls.
I try to keep the calls honest, but if you hear me give the call-in number 3 times in 3 minutes, there is a reason. Every once in a while I'll do it. I don't give the number when the board has callers. So when I give the number, it's already, Andrew is saying to me, there's nobody here. So I say, 1-888 on radio. You too can get in this discussion. And if I come back from the commercial and I say, the first thing I say is, this is Leonard Peikoff doing something, 1-888. If you hear that coming very frequently, you know already that we're definitely short of callers. Now, sometimes the board is full. We get 13, 15, and it's delightful, because it gives you a choice. Whereas if you get 2 callers and that's it, you have to stay with that caller. It doesn't make any difference what language he speaks, because otherwise you're at the mercy. Yeah.
Oh, I think.
Oh, over there, yeah.
How influential has the radio show been for your insights in the role of induction?
That's a good question. I think it's been a factor. It's been a factor because deduction fails so miserably in trying to communicate with people who aren't objectivists. You have to go back to your common basis reality. So I was coming to that very strongly in my own development anyway. But I think it's been a factor. That's an interesting question. Robert, Amy, yeah.
I was just going to speculate as to the success of Picture is Not an Argument and also the one about dirty words. What do you think is the success of shows based on people seeing some kind of conspiracy put over on them? You're saying, yes, look, these pictures are thrown at you all the time, and you're being duped into this.
Terrific point. The audience has a strong right-wing conspiracy edge to it. Those are the people that tune in this type of show and that listen to talk radio. And anything where they feel, this is a negative spin on these epistemological shows, anything where they can interpret that the powers that be are deliberately distorting things to trap them, gets a big rise. Before I finally beat them down, I used to get regular calls saying, didn't I agree that the cause of the country's troubles was the Rockefellers? was the Illuminati, was what else? Jewish bankers, which Masons. I had all that stuff, you know, and I constantly said the standard line that no conspiracy could be powerful enough, and this is ridiculous, and they're making it people because they don't understand the role of ideas. And they just shrugged and said he doesn't understand the role of people, and that was it. But it's true that these shows, there's an edge in the colors that could be interpreted as the powers that be are trying to poison us with propaganda out of Hollywood. That's what they connect with pictures, you see. Or they're rewriting the dictionaries to distort our thinking. And as soon as you can get a paranoid element into it, you know, this guy, what's this guy out of Texas, Art Bell? He shot to the top when he found UFOs out to poison the world or whatever they're doing. There is a strong, tremendous irrationalist, paranoid streak in the right, in the conservative movement, and that can be a factor, but hopefully that's not the whole thing. Yes?
My favorite shows are the philosophical tie-in shows. How well do those work?
The tie-in shows are interesting. Now, Amy, my fiance, is the one who came up with the idea. And the tie-in show, for those of you who don't know, is we take 3 or 4 concretes, utterly on the face of it, unrelated to each other, like Beethoven and something from the headlines. And, you know, we just throw in 3 things, and then we open it up. The first person to state the essential common denominator, philosophically, linking these 3 gets a prize. Now, it's a known fact of radio that if you offer a prize, your lines light up because people will do anything to get even a $10 prize. Just the idea that they get mentioned on the air, they get all excited and they call all their friends, and, you know. But any tie-in show we've ever had, any tie-in contest, is always full line, always. But it's hard to tell how that translates into the audience in general, because the callers are not always, you know, representative of the audience. So there's a certain activist element in the callers that when they hear there's a chance of a prize and a chance of displaying their intelligence on the air and getting publicly praised, seize the phone line. So the shows sound great, but whether some people that I've talked to have a suspicion that a lot of people tune out during those tie-in contests. But they're really eager, and most of them are absolutely not objectivists. They haven't a clue what the common denominator is, but they love trying to get a handle on it. They like the idea, and I think that's very valuable training. Yes.
Do you focus on trying to intrigue people to the next step to read Atlas Shrugged or one of the books? And if so, how do you inductively intrigue people to realize that there's a wider body of ideas? It's not just isolated, you know, one aspect, selfishness versus selflessness.
Well, I've done that partly by giving away. The prizes are always books of Ayn Rand or mine or audio, you know, whichever, where I talk about the book. I've tried to soft pedal to a certain extent this role because I don't want to come across, you know, as the Reverend Schuller, as just a huckster. On the other hand, I think the point has been reached where I can start making a more regular, brief feature. I think we're going to change the close of the show. The close up to now, when I can get in, you know, because I start, and then they start, say 10, 9, 8, and when it gets to 1, I'm off the air. So wherever I am, when he says 10, I've got to go into my close. And sometimes I get a last word just like that before I get off the air. But my close up to now has been, I'll see you next week, or, you know, talk to you next week. Until then, remember, who needs philosophy? You do. And I think we're going to change to something this week from now on to the effect of, you know, you can find out more about all these issues by reading Atlas Shrugged, you see. And by the same token, I'm going to make more at the beginning. Instead of just saying, this is your host, and so, I'm going to have a little formula. This is your host, so-and-so. I stand for reason, selfishness, and capitalism. So that there'll be those kind of a little more plugs here and there as we go. I don't want to become a book salesman and lose credibility. You know what I mean? Yes?
Well, what did you have to learn about using your voice on the radio?
Well, I still haven't learned it properly. I have many very bad vocal habits. One is that when I get emotionally involved, I scream, which comes across really maniacal on the radio. One is out of the desperate feeling of wanting to break through into an audience that I know is not taking in what I'm saying. I have a very disconcerting and bad habit of emphasizing every word. And it becomes, you must see that, you know, and I can't listen. It drives me crazy to hear anybody talk that way. And Andrew is constantly standing there with the sign that says modulate, or he'll go like this, you know, tone it down, be quiet, and then or a sign that says breathe. And I have a great big thing on the, you know, we have a computer tie-in to the satellite company. They put the names and places of the people that are calling in. So we have that plastered with signs like lower your tone. I tend to have a high-pitched tone. And if I think about it, I can make it much lower. But as soon as I get involved in the topic, you see, it goes way up. All kinds of things. I don't have a radio announcer's voice, which is too bad because I'm not soothing. Plus, I'm getting better on this, but I used to have the idea of correcting everything that was wrong. And the result was the caller would say, hi, and I'd plunge right in. So now I have to say, never interrupt the first two sentences. If the first sentence is Hitler was the greatest ever, and you just wait and let him go on and say because he was a partner in McDonald's or whatever the reason was, you know. And then, you know, so you have to have the forbearance to sit there and hear utter garbage. And the trick is to try to decide. If you cut it off too soon, it's not a talk show. And the people don't phone because they just say hi and then that's it. And on the other hand, if you cut it off too late, they tune out because this guy's boring, he's crazy, he's blaring on about something, and why do you let him go on? And there's like you have a range of 2 seconds in which it's either too early or too late, and everybody else listening to the show has already made up their mind that he should stay on or he shouldn't. So it's a very tricky thing, especially because they bring up 8 different things in the first 2 sentences. So I got to be picking which 2, and I have a prearranged set of like 10 points that I want to feed out. So I'm trying to relate the 2 that I picked from him to the 10 over here. But if I wait 1 second too long, he's on to his next 9th point, and then it's too late, you see. So I'm not good at this. If I knew less, if I had less to say, and I had a more trained voice, it would be a much more effective show. But those are some of the things I'm struggling to try to learn. Yes.
Looking at this band of the population that you've now had interaction with over a couple of years, are there things that are positive now, new views that you have about what's happening in people's minds that are on the positive level? And do you have some things that you've seen now in talking to these folks a lot that are a little more frightening than you might have?
Well, I wouldn't say more frightening. I mean, there's weirdos out there, but there's weirdos everywhere. But what's encouraging is that they stop calling when they see they can't get a rise out of it. And, you know, there's hoaxsters at the beginning, which I was taken into. I just, for a couple of months, believed if somebody said he was with the Santa Monica police, that he was. And then he'd go on and say hair-raising things, and I'd say, why do you do that as a policeman? They thought that was fabulous, they enjoyed that. I mean, the callers, But after a while, you get to know that. But once you drop those people out, I have a mixed impression. There are a lot of people out there that never read Ayn Rand, that don't know anything about philosophy, and that have an actual interest in these issues. Uneducated people. And that is heartening. You pretty regularly come up with people who say, I listen to your show all the time. I never took any philosophy. I've never read any of this stuff, but it makes sense. I disagree with you on this or that, but, they get hooked. And, that is a very satisfying thing, that you actually can reach people this way. On the other hand, from what I can tell, you reach a thin layer of people. This is not going to be the means of mass conversion, because the great bulk of people, the curse, you're trying to syndicate a show, across the country, and the curse is as soon as the program director finds that it's philosophy. Because as soon as they hear that it's philosophy, they classify it as a niche show. And a niche show means it's in the category of stamp collecting, or, it appeals to just a tiny group. And so far, I'd have to say that's true. That is, that we get a thin, broad layer of people, and from a lot of different walks of life and so on. But we certainly are not pulling the kind of numbers that would suggest that the markets are just avid for philosophy over the radio. So I have a mixed, but it may be too early to know, because we're getting into new markets. And you have to fight the number of people that want to establish a radio show. Is, if you remember if you read about the old days, like when there was the big MGM and 20th Century Fox studios, if you went off the street and wrote a letter to Jack Warner and said you want to be the lead in his next movie, you have basically as much chance of achieving that then as you have of getting a talk show now. Some of these big stations, you would believe it or not, because it astounded me, get 50 submissions a day, and including packages of demo tapes, slick literature, and the whole thing from people with long visas and experience and gimmicks, etc. They employ people for the sole purpose of throwing out the application. So it's become a gimmick in the industry. What can you send with your application so they'll open it? For instance, one of the big successes sent everyone in the station a pizza if they would eat it while they tore open his application. And now food has gone past and is reaching the stage of actual monetary gift. It's not outright. This is just to be thrown out, but to be open before you're thrown out. So the competition is just tremendous. And if you come in with, I have a philosophy, and it happens to be rejected by all of your listeners, it's a tremendous odds. Yes. Over there. Yeah.
I wanted to know if you got anything particularly special from your experience on Politically Incorrect or other TV shows that you're able to carry over and use on your radio show.
Well, the only thing I got out of my experience on Politically Correct, beside the fact that William Shatner talks too much, was I was astounded at how many people around the country watched that show. I never watched it. And I heard from people that, like they say happens to lottery winners from childhood, people I hadn't been in touch with for decades, who happened to see that show. So it certainly is the means to popularity, but it didn't really have any long-term consequences. They asked me back, and I guess I made a strategic mistake of refusing to come back on the topic they wanted me to come back on, which I've been told since I should have agreed to come back on even so, but I thought it was unfair. And I said no, and then so they wrote me off thereafter because they're used to, you know, phoning the president, and he comes right away, which I guess you should do. But they wanted me to come on with an orphan and say that according to my view, he should be thrown out on the streets and the government shouldn't help him. And I said that that's ridiculous because it makes it look like it's only government orphanages that I don't want funded. I will do it if you have a big businessman who's on the take on too, so that I can say I want both the big businessman and the orphan thrown out on the street. But not make it just the orphans. But, I mean, they were just affronted that I would have the, you know, the audacity to put conditions on appearing on it. So I don't, nothing really came of it. Yes.
Yes, I'd like to conjecture about the mystery shows too. Maybe I can win a prize.
The tie-in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, not the tie-in shows. The ones you didn't expect to go over
yeah.
so well.
Yeah.
Which is, I got the impression as you were describing them that these were things, situations where the audience felt either frightened or hurt. And like, what do you mean? I can't tell what's going on by looking at a picture. That's always how I tell what's going on.
No, but they were all sympathetic to my theme.
But I think it's inherently frightening because it's how do I tell what's going on out in the world?
Well, no, they more conveyed real indignation that these pictures were being passed off as argument and that they were exploding over something that had bothered them, but they hadn't really realized. That was the idea. They did not convey fear. That's why I think the suggestion that maybe we're unmasking a behind-the-scenes conspiracy more tended to. That's my opinion anyway. Yes, Christopher.
I was wondering if you can give me some reasons as to why a show such as Howard Stern's is so popular.
I heard Howard Stern a couple of times, and I wish I could. Howard Stern, of course, is a completely different kind of show. Now, some of his stands are conservative and right-wing. So he gets an audience from the fact that he's not a liberal. But I think his biggest audience is he pioneered the shock jock format. And I've heard him be interviewed, and he said that he's only really alive on the air, and his rule on the air is anything in his mind goes out over the airways. He has no controls, deliberately whatever. So it's basically like the pleasure or the thrill to his followers. He feels like cursing, or he feels like discussing his sexual activities with his wife in graphic detail, or whatever he feels like he'll do. So it's the shock of the unpredictable, and there's a large audience for that laugh at the vulgarity, but admire him. They take it as courage, especially his fight, you know, with the FCC. I think he's so vulgar and so foul-mouthed that I can't listen to it. I don't think it's a good sign about the country that Howard Stern is so popular. In fact, of all the big popular radio shows, I think he's the worst sign. The most debased sign, because a show like that could never have caught on in the 50s or even the 60s. Now, but some of the top-rated shows, I think, have a lot to offer and are signs in the right direction. For instance, Rush Limbaugh, for all of his, differences, is generally puts on a good show with reasonable commentary for what you can expect for a non-philosopher. He's read from Galt's speech. He's even read the most contentious parts of Galt's speech admiringly on his show, you know, the denunciation of sacrifice. He doesn't have a big philosophic understanding, but he is courageous, and he is really hated by the liberals. I mean, they really regard him as a threat. And from that point of view, I defend him. And I think it's a good sign that he's way up in the clouds in terms of his ratings and the multi-millions that he makes. I've gone to a convention of talk show hosts, and the universal attitude toward Rush Limbaugh is that they're absolutely green with envy. And year after year, I hear the same thing. He's had his day, and he's passing. He's losing his stations. He went from 550 to 548, you know. And these people have 25, and they're dying, you know. So I think Dr. Laura, who is a very big syndicated psychological advice show, has a lot of bad things about her, which is obvious, but she's got a lot of moral absolutism, albeit religious, and she calls a spade a spade. She has no compassion. She's very harsh with these people, mostly women that call her up and can't decide, etc. She whips them into line like a drill sergeant, which is good. I mean, I listen to her because it's enjoyable to hear her tell these callers off and say, this is immoral, this is an outrage, how dare you live your life that way? She's just the opposite of the cultural bromide, and it's an excellent sign. I think that she is as successful as she is. So I don't think I think the radio audience on the whole is definitely, well, it's incomparably superior to the TV audience. I mentioned that before. You cannot get issues on TV. It's impossible. We explored doing a TV show at one point, and nobody would come near it, not on the grounds that it was controversial, but on the grounds that you needed McLuhan-esque visuals. And you know what that means? In other words, you need visuals that are hopping and popping and jumping all the time, and zigzag lines and fiery music and maniacs from Mars sleeping with ashtrays, you know. So, and just to have people talk about ideas is dead. The people on TV regard it as a perceptual medium only, you know, like it was a moving jigsaw puzzle, which is basically all it is. And therefore, the radio is a much more hopeful sign, and more hopeful in a way than newspapers, because thanks to talk radio, it's not dominated by a left-wing liberal elite. So I don't know how we got onto this. I think Howard Stern is a bad example of a debased side of the public, but he is by no means the only thing out there. It's good to come from that too. I got to take a couple more. Yes.
Okay, you mentioned that radio is much more of a conceptual medium than television, and you also mentioned the demographics of your show, which is a lot of the older generation, 60, 50, 60 and above. And I was thinking, well, this could be a simple marketing strategy of the station or part of a wider cultural trend, and I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
You mean why do only older people listen? Well, basically, it's become a trend in this country that younger people listen to music stations. For what reason, I'm not sure, but it's a general axiom that the music stations, you know, popular music stations, what do you call it? Rock, and I don't even know all the permutations and combinations of it, but there's 100 different stations that appeal to that. And these people have their own vocabulary and their own worldview, and they get it through music. They're much more oriented toward music as a means of communication, or let's say philosophic expression, than they are toward abstractions in any form, toward theory or ideas. I think it's probably a result of education. But what happens is that at a certain point, apparently, judging by the demographics, they get to the point where the latest wave of music is too much for them, you know, because each generation can take theirs, but when the next one comes and they start drilling their chisel right into your eardrum, that's too much. So they give up, and they're also, some of them, wondering at that time, you know, becoming more thoughtful, and they switch over then to talk radio. Now, if there was a marketing way to get a younger group to listen to radio, I think that would be a massive breakthrough. And that would be a guarantee way, if you could tell a talk show, which is used to a demographics of 50 and above, that you have a big audience in their teens and 20s, that would be a massive selling point. But it's very hard to deliver that. Except, you know, for objectivists or people like that that are pre-sold on philosophy and will tune you in because they agree. We've put ads in college papers, no results. And you know what kind of budget it takes to try to change a whole market segment. You know, you say to me, how much would it take to go after the teenagers of America, familiarize them with talk radio and get them to tune in? I mean, you're talking, I don't know, I'm not a businessman. You're certainly talking in multi-million-dollar budget to be able to do that. I mean, $250,000, $500,000, $1 million wouldn't get you. You know, it'd be easier just to go out and knock on doorbells and hand people $200 and say, listen to the show. Okay, I want to take, I think, a couple more. Peter.
What have you enjoyed the most and least in your life as a talk show host?
I think what I enjoy the most is being able to have a forum to express my reactions to what's going on. Without this, you read the newspaper. The most I would have had before this would be the chance to write a brief letter to the editor, which usually gets truncated. And this way, you know, if I'm steaming over some clipping or occasionally am favorable and want to defend something, I come all gung-ho and I've got a, such as it is, national audience to express myself. Now, I don't have the illusion that it's a mass audience, but, you know, it gives me an outlet. What I enjoy the least about it is, I wouldn't even so much say the repetition, because there's not that much repetition. I think I enjoy the least about it is the insecurity of having authentic callers. That is, people other than objectivists who are calling in out of kindness. You never can know. And Andrew and I always look at each other at 10 minutes after, 20 minutes after, is there anybody on the board? And there's a suspense and then a letdown. And then if there's no callers or there are very few callers, it's very hard to keep yourself pumped up and excited because you can feel, you know, it's like the opening night of a show that is fizzling and the audience is walking out. So it's the showbiz aspect that I enjoy the least. I mean, the failing showbiz. When it's a topic that I feel strongly about and there's an active audience participation, the whole thing is, I enjoy it thoroughly. And I like performing in that way. And particularly if Andrew tells me you didn't scream today or not too much. You know. All right, one last one.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could say something about how successful your show is in terms of profitability and what your audience size is.
Well, their show is, if you judge it in terms of profitability, it's a total failure because it's not attempting to earn any money at this stage. It's completely subsidized. And the only way that you can get on is what they call a barter arrangement. The barter arrangement, that's for beginning shows, is they run you in exchange for being able to run commercials to your audience. So you don't pay to get on, but on the other hand, you don't make anything unless you can get advertised. And advertisers don't come unless you have a big market. And a big market does not come simply because you go on the air. We do not have a big market. We have 4 stations across the country now. The biggest being LA and then Virginia, which is a 50,000 watt station. And we have smaller stations, a couple in between. We don't take ratings everywhere. It's impossible to tell. It's somewhere, my audience is somewhere. It really would be hard to say because it varies, you know, day to day and week to week. The most reliable rating I had when I was daily, we were averaging in Southern California about 40 plus 1,000 listeners a day. Now, that doesn't sound like a great deal, but it was a fair amount. It was enough so that I was a presence in this way. If I talked, for instance, about Israel on a given show, within 10 minutes of the time that that show went on, the head of the Jewish Defense League would be on the air to give his side. So in other words, the show was monitored by all these community groups. If I talked about abortion, there was someone, from anti-abortion there. And I felt that at that time I was, in a modest way, becoming a voice in the market. We started now on Sunday morning because that's the easiest time to try to get cleared across the country. But the reason it's the easiest time is nobody listens on Sunday morning. So it's too soon really to tell how it's going to do on a national basis. Okay, well, I appreciate your question. Thank you very much.